The sun was low in the sky, and the colors of the canyon glowed in warm shades of orange and red. A lone cowboy rode his tired horse along a narrow trail that wound between high cliffs. His hat was tilted low to keep the sun out of his eyes, and the sound of his spurs was the only music in that empty land. He had been riding for days after finishing a cattle drive, and now he was heading east with no real plan except to keep moving. The trail was rough, and the silence made him feel like the world had forgotten him. But he was a man used to the wide spaces, and he didn't mind the loneliness. He stopped by a small stream to let his horse drink, and as he bent to refill his canteen, something unusual caught his ear. At first he thought it was just the call of a bird echoing off the rocks, but then he heard it again, sharp and desperate like a human cry. His head lifted quickly and his hand moved to the rifle slung across his saddle. In these lands, cries often meant trouble, and trouble could come in many shapes. He stood still, listening. The cry came again, faint but clear, carried by the wind from the direction of the river bend. Cautious but curious, the cowboy mounted his horse and urged it forward. The trail twisted through the canyon until it opened into a small flat space near the river. There, his eyes widened at what he saw. 3 Apache women were bound to wooden stakes driven into the ground. Their ankles and wrists were tied with rough rope, and their faces were streaked with dust and tears. Their dark hair was tangled, their traditional dresses torn from struggle. They looked exhausted, their heads dropping forward as if they had given up hope. The cowboy's breath caught in his throat. He had heard stories of raids and rival groups, but he never expected to stumble upon something like this. His first thought was danger. Whoever had tied them there might still be close. He scanned the area carefully, his eyes darting to the brush, the cliffs, and the open riverbank. The place was silent except for the river's soft rush. No riders, no campfire smoke, no footprints fresh enough to mark a presence. Still, his instincts told him to stay sharp. Slowly, he dismounted and approached. The women looked up, their eyes wide with fear. They flinched as he came closer, unsure if this new stranger was friend or foe. The cowboy removed his hat and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Easy now. I ain't here to harm you." His words were simple, but his tone carried honesty. One of the women whispered in Apache, and though he didn't understand every word, he caught the meaning in her pleading eyes. She wanted freedom. The cowboy knelt beside the first woman and pulled out his knife. With a quick slice, he cut the ropes from her wrists and ankles. She gasped, rubbing her sore skin, and tears slid down her dusty cheeks. He moved to the second, then the third, freeing them one by one. Each time they looked at him with disbelief, as though they could not believe a cowboy would risk himself for them. When they were free, the women staggered to their feet, weak from hours of captivity. One nearly fell, and the cowboy caught her gently, steadying her by the arm. He guided them to the shade of a tree near the riverbank. From his saddlebag, he pulled a small piece of bread, some dried meat, and a water flask. He offered it without hesitation. They ate hungrily, drinking deeply, their strength slowly returning. As they ate, he studied them carefully. They were young, perhaps in their 20s, their faces still carrying the grace of their people despite the dust and weariness. Each had beads and small pieces of jewelry that showed their heritage. Their eyes, though filled with gratitude, still held a shadow of fear. The cowboy tried to ask what had happened using broken words and gestures. From what he gathered, they had been taken by an enemy band, men who meant them harm. But for some reason, instead of carrying them away, the men had tied them to the stakes and left. Perhaps they planned to return. Perhaps they had been chased off. Whatever the reason, the danger was not gone. The women looked around nervously as if expecting their captors to appear at any moment. One of them pressed her palms together, her voice trembling as she spoke. Though he could not fully understand her words, the cowboy could see her meaning. She was begging him not to leave them there. He nodded firmly. "Don't worry. I'll see you safe." It was not a promise he made lightly. He knew the risks of taking 3 Apache women under his care. If their people saw them with him, they might think he had stolen them. If the enemy riders returned, he would be outnumbered. But the cowboy's sense of honor left him no choice. Leaving them behind would have been like leaving a wounded horse to die in the desert. He simply couldn't do it. He brought his horse closer and helped the women climb onto its back. The animal shifted under the extra weight, but it held steady. The cowboy walked beside them, leading the reins as the sun dipped lower in the sky. The shadows stretched long across the canyon floor and the cool evening air settled in. The journey was slow. The women were weak and the horse tired, but they moved steadily away from the river. Every sound of breaking twig or distant coyote cry made them flinch, and the cowboy kept his rifle ready at his side. Yet as the miles passed, a strange calm began to grow between them. The women looked at him not just with fear but with hope, their eyes following his every step as though he carried their future in his hands. That night, they made a small camp in a sheltered hollow. The cowboy built a fire from dry branches, the flames casting a warm glow against the rocks. He gave them blankets from his pack and made sure they ate enough to regain some strength. The women sat close together, whispering in their language, but their glances often fell on him. They watched the way he worked, steady, quiet, never harsh. As the stars filled the sky, the cowboy leaned back against his saddle and listened to the night sounds. The women's voices grew softer, their words carrying tones of relief and gratitude. Though he couldn't understand it all, he felt their trust growing, like a fragile seed taking root in the soil. The cowboy knew tomorrow would bring new challenges. He would have to guide them through dangerous land, with enemies possibly on their trail. But as he watched the 3 Apache women slowly close their eyes by the fire, their breathing deep and calm, he felt something stir inside him. For the first time in a long while, he was not just a wanderer with no direction. He had a purpose now, and it was written in the eyes of those who had begged him silently to save them. He whispered to himself, "You're safe with me." The fire cracked softly, and the canyon held its peace as if the land itself had heard his vow. The morning sun rose slowly over the canyon walls, spreading light across the camp. The cowboy stirred first, waking to the crackle of dying embers in the fire. His horse lifted its head and snorted softly, as if sensing the day ahead would be long and difficult. He rubbed his eyes and looked at the 3 Apache women who were still sleeping close together, their faces peaceful for the first time since he had found them. For a moment he felt a sense of relief. They were alive, free and safe, at least for now, but safety in this land never lasted long. He knew that. Every canyon had shadows that could hide enemies, and every open plain could expose them to danger. The cowboy had lived too long on the trail not to understand that moving forward was their only chance. He stood up quietly, packed his small blanket, and checked his rifle. Then he set about preparing for the day, filling his canteen from the river and tightening the saddle straps. The women woke soon after, blinking against the bright sun. Their movements were slow, their bodies still weak from their time in captivity. One tried to stand but stumbled, and the cowboy quickly helped her, offering his arm without a word. She gave him a faint smile, shy and tired, but it carried a spark of gratitude. They shared what little food he had left, dried meat, bread, and a few sips of water. The cowboy knew it wouldn't last long, and his mind was already working on where to find more supplies. He thought about the nearest trading post miles away, and he thought about the wild berries and small game that the land might provide. For now, they would have to rely on his knowledge of the trail and the women's knowledge of the wilderness. When it was time to move, the cowboy led his horse again, the women riding together on its back. The path ahead wound through rocks and open fields, the air heavy with the scent of sagebrush. The cowboy walked steadily, his boots crunching on gravel, his eyes scanning every rise and dip in the land. The women stayed silent at first, holding tightly to the horse and to each other. But slowly, as the morning stretched on, they began to relax. At one point, one of the women pointed to the sky where an eagle circled high above. She said a word in her language, and the cowboy repeated it, his accent rough but his effort sincere. The women giggled softly, surprised that he had tried. Encouraged, he asked them to teach him a few more words: water, food, safe. They laughed again, correcting him gently, their voices carrying a warmth that began to break the heavy silence of the trail. This small exchange built something fragile but important between them. The cowboy could feel the women's fear slowly melting into trust. They still glanced around nervously, watching for enemies, but their eyes also followed him as if measuring his strength and reliability. And every time he looked back at them, he offered a nod or a small smile, a silent promise that he would not abandon them. By midday, the heat pressed down hard, and the group rested beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees. The cowboy let his horse graze while he searched the bushes for anything edible. He managed to find a patch of prickly pears and carefully cut away the thorns. The women watched him, impressed, then showed him how to prepare the fruit properly. They laughed again when he made a face at the bitter taste, but then they handed him pieces prepared their way, sweet and refreshing. Together they shared the meal, and the distance between them seemed to shrink. That afternoon, the trail grew more difficult. They had to cross a rocky slope where loose stones threatened to trip the horse. The women slid off and walked beside the cowboy, steadying themselves with his hand when needed. Their soft sandals scraped against the stones and their dresses brushed the dust, but they did not complain. The cowboy noticed their quiet strength, the way they endured hardship without words. It reminded him of the endurance of the land itself, tough, unyielding, and beautiful. When the sun began to set, painting the sky with streaks of pink and gold, they found a sheltered spot near a small stream to camp. The cowboy gathered wood for a fire while the women helped arrange stones into a circle. For the first time, they worked side by side, not as strangers, but as a group bound together by the journey. The fire burned warmly, chasing away the chill of the evening, and they shared another simple meal. As night deepened, the women began to open up. One of them, speaking slowly and mixing words in her language with gestures, told the cowboy about their village, their families, and the raid that had taken them away. Her eyes filled with tears as she remembered, and the other two comforted her softly. The cowboy listened intently, nodding, his face serious. He couldn't understand every word, but he understood enough. They had lost much, and now they were holding on to whatever hope remained. The cowboy then shared a little about himself. He told them about growing up on the plains, about learning to ride before he could properly walk, about losing his parents young and having to fend for himself. His voice was steady, not seeking pity, but simply offering truth. The women listened closely, their eyes softening with understanding. For the first time, they saw not just a rescuer, but a man with his own scars and loneliness. Around the fire, something shifted. The women began to smile more, even laugh softly at his attempts to mimic their words or his stories of stubborn horses and wild cattle. Their laughter was light, like music in the quiet canyon. The cowboy felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For years he had lived a life of solitude, his only companions the trail and his horse. But now in this moment he felt part of something larger, a bond that didn't need words to explain. Later, as the stars filled the sky, the women lay down close to the fire, wrapped in the blankets he had given them. The cowboy sat a little apart, his rifle across his knees, keeping watch. The land was still, but his thoughts were restless. He thought of the dangers still ahead, raiders, wild animals, the harsh desert miles. Yet he also thought of the women's trust, of their eyes looking to him as if he carried their future. He wondered why fate had placed them in his path, and what it meant for the road ahead. The women, before sleep took them, whispered softly to each other. Though he could not understand, he knew by their tone that they were speaking about him. There was gratitude in their voices and something deeper, perhaps a belief that this cowboy was not just a rescuer, but a man chosen by destiny to guide them. When silence finally fell, the cowboy looked up at the wide night sky, stars glittering like scattered fire across the black. He breathed deeply, feeling the cool night air fill his lungs. The sound of the women's steady breathing by the fire gave him a strange peace. For the first time in many years, he did not feel completely alone. He had 3 lives depending on him now, and with that responsibility came a sense of purpose that made him stand taller. He whispered into the night, more to himself than to anyone else, "I'll see you through this, whatever it takes." The wind shifted softly through the canyon, carrying his words into the dark, as if the land itself bore witness to his vow. The next day began with a soft gray sky, the kind that promised both coolness and hidden dangers. The cowboy rose early as usual, his boots crunching lightly on the sand as he checked the horse and gathered wood for a small fire. The 3 Apache women stirred slowly, rubbing the sleep from their eyes. Their hair, long and dark, was tangled from the night, but their faces seemed calmer than before. They no longer looked like prisoners. They looked like travelers moving together with him. After a simple breakfast, they set off again, the horse carrying the women while the cowboy led on foot. The land stretched wide, rolling hills of dry grass with scattered mesquite trees. The air smelled of dust and sage, and every sound carried far. The cowboy stayed alert, scanning the horizon for riders. He knew it was unlikely that their pursuers had given up completely. Raiders rarely forgot or forgave, and 3 women were too valuable for them to abandon. The women, though still weak, began to show more of themselves as the trail went on. They spoke softly among each other, sometimes laughing at private jokes. Now and then they tried to teach the cowboy more words from their language. He repeated them clumsily, and his mistakes made them laugh harder. The laughter felt good to him, like music in the empty plains. It reminded him that life could hold joy even in times of fear. At midday they rested in the shade of a rocky outcrop. The cowboy sat sharpening his knife while the women searched the ground for edible roots and plants. They returned with handfuls of wild onions and herbs. The cowboy was surprised when they roasted the onions on the fire, the sharp smell filling the air. He tasted them with interest, nodding at the rich flavor. The women smiled proudly, happy to share knowledge of their land. That evening, as the sun sank and turned the sky red, they made camp near a narrow canyon. The fire burned low, the flames reflecting in the women's dark eyes. The cowboy leaned back against his saddle, tired but watchful. The women sat close together, whispering quietly. After a time, one of them looked at him directly, her expression serious. She touched her chest, then pointed at the other 2 women, and finally at him. Her words were soft, almost like a chant, and though he couldn't fully understand, her meaning was clear. They were saying they belonged with him now. The cowboy felt a weight in his chest. He was not used to such devotion. In his life, people came and went, drifting like tumbleweeds in the wind. But here were 3 women, survivors of hardship, who now looked at him as if he were their anchor. He lowered his gaze, unsure of what to say. He was just a man, no more, no less. Yet in their eyes, he was something larger. The night passed quietly, but the bond between them grew stronger. The following day brought new challenges. As they crossed a dry riverbed, the cowboy noticed fresh hoofprints in the dust. His heart tightened. Someone had passed through not long ago, perhaps only hours earlier. He crouched low, touching the prints, more than one rider moving quickly. He stood and glanced at the women. Their faces showed fear. They understood what those tracks meant. "We need to keep moving," the cowboy said firmly, though he doubted they understood the words. His tone was enough. He helped them mount again and pushed the pace. They rode hard through the afternoon, the horse sweating, its sides heaving. The cowboy never let his guard down. Every ridge, every cluster of rocks, every shadow seemed to hide danger. He could almost feel eyes watching them. By the time the sun began to sink, they reached higher ground where the view stretched far across the plains. The cowboy led them into a grove of junipers and made camp in silence. He kept the fire small, worried that smoke might give them away. The women sensed his unease and stayed quiet, their eyes wide in the dim light. Later, as they sat together, the women began to share more of their lives. Through broken words and gestures, they told him about their families, about dances under the moonlight, about children playing by the river before the raid had torn everything apart. Their voices carried both sadness and hope. They wanted him to know who they were, not just what had happened to them. The cowboy listened closely. He had never been a man of many words, but he respected stories. He told them a little of his own life again, how he had drifted from ranch to ranch, never belonging anywhere. His eyes softened when he admitted that he had often wondered if his life had any real meaning. The women leaned closer, their faces lit by the glow of the fire. One of them reached out, touching his arm gently. She spoke in a low, steady voice, her words slow so he might understand. Though he caught only fragments, he knew what she meant. She was saying that he had meaning now because of them. For a long while, the cowboy sat in silence, his throat tight. The fire cracked softly, and the stars above seemed brighter than ever. He realized then that the bond between them was no longer born of rescue alone. It had grown into something deeper, a trust that went both ways. He protected them, but they also gave him something he had never had before: belonging. The next morning, the bond showed itself in small but powerful ways. As they walked, one of the women began to sing softly, a song in her language. The sound floated over the dry land like a prayer. The cowboy didn't understand the words, but he felt the strength in the melody. It steadied his steps and lifted his heart. Another woman walked beside him for a time, handing him wild berries she had gathered. The smallest gestures carried great weight. That evening, while gathering wood, The cowboy returned to find the women had prepared a small circle of stones decorated with feathers and beads from their jewelry. They motioned for him to sit. It was some kind of blessing ritual, a way to honor the spirits for keeping them safe. They included him in it, treating him not as an outsider but as part of their circle. He sat with them quietly, the smoke of sage rising, their voices murmuring prayers. When one of the women pressed a bead into his palm, closing his hand around it, he felt a warmth spread through his chest. He knew then that they had accepted him fully, and in turn he felt himself accepting them. That night, as the firelight flickered and the stars wheeled overhead, the cowboy lay awake for a long time. He thought of the vow unspoken between them. He thought of how their laughter, their songs, and their stories had already begun to change him. He realized that he no longer felt like a wanderer with no place in the world. With them, he had found a kind of family. But he also knew the danger was not over. Somewhere beyond the dark hills, riders might still be following. Trouble was always near in this land. Yet as he looked at the three women sleeping peacefully by the fire, he promised himself again that he would protect them, no matter the cost. The wind shifted through the canyon, cool against his face. He pulled the blanket tighter and whispered into the dark, "You're not alone anymore. Not while I'm breathing." And with that vow, unspoken yet as strong as any sacred oath, he finally closed his eyes, letting sleep come with the comfort of knowing that he and the three women were no longer strangers. They were bound together, heart to heart, stronger than fear, stronger even than the dangers waiting on the trail ahead. The morning air was cooler than before, carrying with it a sharp stillness that made the cowboy uneasy. He rose early, his eyes scanning the horizon while the women slept close to the remains of the fire. His instincts told him that their journey was about to grow harder. The tracks he had seen days before still troubled his thoughts. He knew the land too well to believe that danger had passed them by. The cowboy saddled his horse and gently woke the women. They rose quickly, sensing the urgency in his tone. They shared a small meal of dried berries and bread, then set off again, moving swiftly across the plains. The cowboy kept his rifle close at hand, every sense alert. The women riding together clutched the horse tightly, their eyes wide as they scanned the land around them. By midday, the sky had turned harsh and bright, the sun beating down on their backs. Sweat dripped down the cowboy's face as he led the horse through a stretch of dry riverbed. The land felt exposed here with nowhere to hide. Suddenly he noticed something that made his stomach tighten, fresh hoofprints cutting across their path. These were not old tracks. They were sharp, deep, and recent. The cowboy crouched, touching the dust with his fingers. He looked up at the women and shook his head. "They're close," he said in a low voice. The women didn't understand the words, but they understood the fear in his eyes. He urged them forward, quickening the pace. For hours they pressed on, the sound of the horse's hooves echoing against the canyon walls. The cowboy's heart pounded, his mind racing. He had faced danger before, but this was different. He wasn't alone now. He had 3 lives depending on him. As the afternoon wore on, the sound he had feared finally came. Distant hoofbeats, faint at first but growing louder. The cowboy froze, tilting his head to listen. There was no mistaking it. Riders were following. The women's faces turned pale, their bodies trembling. One of them whispered something in fear, clutching the arm of another. "Stay calm," the cowboy said firmly, though inside his chest a storm raged. He pulled his horse off the main trail, guiding them through a narrow cut in the rocks. The passage was tight, barely wide enough for the animal, but it offered cover. They moved quickly, dust rising behind them, the sound of hoofbeats echoing closer and closer. When they emerged on the other side, the cowboy led them up a steep slope where junipers grew thick. He ordered the women down from the horse with a gesture, then tied the reins to a tree. His eyes scanned the open land below. In the distance, he saw them at last, 5 riders, dark shapes against the bright plain, moving fast. The women pressed close together, their eyes wide with fear. The cowboy crouched beside them, speaking in a steady tone. "We'll be all right. Stay quiet, stay low." He knew he couldn't fight 5 men head-on. He had to outthink them. As the riders drew nearer, dust rising behind their horses, the cowboy led the women deeper into the brush. He moved silently, every step careful. They followed his lead, trusting him completely. The riders reached the riverbed below, their shouts carrying through the hot air. They searched the ground, clearly tracking the prints. The cowboy's jaw tightened. He needed to buy time. He guided the women higher into the rocks until they found a small hollow hidden by boulders. It was a natural shelter, just large enough for the four of them. He motioned for the women to stay there while he crawled out to watch. From his vantage point, he saw the riders spread out below, scanning the land. One dismounted, bending low to study the dirt. The cowboy knew they would find the trail soon. He took a breath, his mind working quickly. He gathered a handful of stones and tossed them far to the right, where they clattered down the rocks loudly. The riders snapped their heads toward the sound, shouting as they spurred their horses in that direction. Dust rose in a cloud as they charged toward the noise. The cowboy exhaled slowly, relief flooding him. He crawled back to the women who clutched each other tightly. He put a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. For nearly an hour they stayed hidden, listening to the distant thunder of hooves fade and return, then fade again. The riders were circling, searching. When at last the sounds grew faint, the cowboy knew they had to move. He led the women carefully along the ridge, keeping to the shadows. They traveled for miles without stopping, the fear of capture driving them forward. The women's faces were pale, but their steps were steady. They trusted him, even when every muscle in their bodies ached. By nightfall, they reached another canyon. Exhausted, they made camp in a hollow beneath tall rocks. The cowboy built only a tiny fire, shielding it with stones. The women sat close together, whispering in low voices. Their eyes reflected both fear and admiration as they looked at him. Later, as they sat by the fire, one of the women leaned forward. She touched his hand lightly and spoke in her language, her voice trembling but strong. Though he couldn't understand all the words, he caught the meaning. She was thanking him. The others joined in, nodding, their voices soft but full of emotion. The cowboy felt a lump in his throat. He had never asked for gratitude. He had only done what was right. But hearing their voices, seeing their eyes filled with trust, stirred something deep in him. These women had been through pain and fear, yet here they were, finding hope again, through him. As the night grew quiet, the cowboy sharpened his knife while keeping watch. The women lay near the fire, whispering before sleep finally claimed them. He listened to their soft breathing and felt a strange comfort. He knew tomorrow might bring more danger. The riders were still out there hunting, but for now, in this moment, they were safe. He gazed up at the stars, his rifle resting across his lap. The weight of responsibility pressed on him, heavier than any saddle or pack, yet with it came a sense of purpose he had never known before. These three women were no longer strangers. They were part of his life now, and he would protect them with everything he had. The wind shifted softly through the canyon, carrying the faint cry of an owl. The cowboy tightened his grip on the rifle and whispered to himself, "I won't let them take you. Not while I've got breath in me." And with that vow, he kept his silent watch, the fire glowing faintly beside him, the three women asleep under the wide and endless sky, their trust resting fully on his shoulders. The sky turned golden as the first light of dawn stretched across the canyon. The cowboy sat near the dying fire, his hat low over his brow, the rifle resting across his knees. He had not slept much through the night. His eyes had stayed fixed on the shadows, listening for hoofbeats that never came. The three Apache women were asleep close together, their breathing soft and steady. Their faces in the firelight seemed calmer than they had ever been, as if for a brief moment the weight of fear had lifted from them. When morning came, the cowboy rose and saddled his horse. The women woke slowly, stretching their tired limbs. They no longer looked like captives. Their faces carried a strength that had returned during the long days on the trail. The cowboy gave them water and a small piece of bread. It was not much, but it was enough to keep them moving. He knew they needed to reach safer ground soon. The day's journey was hard. They crossed open plains where the sun beat down like fire, then wound through rocky passages where every sound echoed loudly. The cowboy led them with steady steps, never slowing, never letting his guard drop. The women followed him closely, their eyes watching him with complete trust. Sometimes, when the trail grew difficult, one of them would reach out and hold his arm, steadying herself. He would help her without a word, his strength quiet but sure. By midday, they reached a high ridge that looked out over the vast land below. The cowboy stopped there, scanning the horizon. He saw no riders, no dust rising in the distance. For the first time in many days, he felt a little hope. Perhaps the pursuers had given up. Perhaps fate was finally giving them a chance to breathe. They rested in the shade of the ridge, eating a handful of berries the women had gathered. The cowboy leaned back against a rock, his eyes closing briefly as the cool wind brushed his face. When he opened them, he saw the women watching him closely. Their expressions were serious, almost solemn. One of them spoke in a soft voice, her words slow and careful. She touched her chest, then pointed to him. The others nodded, repeating the same gesture. The cowboy frowned, not fully understanding. But then one of the women leaned forward, her dark eyes fixed on his. In halting words, mixing her tongue with bits of English she had picked up, she whispered, "Take us. With you, we obey you. Forever." The words struck him harder than any bullet could. He stared at them, stunned, his heart heavy with the weight of their vow. These were not words spoken out of fear. Their eyes were calm, their voices steady. They were choosing him. They were asking him to guide them, to be the man they would follow wherever the trail led. The cowboy lowered his head, his jaw tight. All his life he had been a wanderer, drifting from one place to another with no home and no family. He had never belonged anywhere, never had anyone who looked to him with such trust. Yet here in this wild land, 3 women who had every reason to fear the world had given him their loyalty freely. For a long moment he said nothing. He simply looked at them, their faces lit by the sunlight, their eyes steady on his. Finally, he placed his hat over his heart and spoke in a voice low but filled with emotion. "If you ride with me, then I'll never leave you. I'll protect you no matter what." The women bowed their heads slightly as if accepting a sacred vow. One of them reached forward and took his hand gently, pressing it to her forehead. The others followed, each one showing him the same gesture of loyalty and gratitude. The cowboy felt a warmth spread through his chest, a feeling stronger than any he had ever known. That evening, as they traveled down from the ridge, the bond between them was different. No longer was it only about rescue and survival. Now it was about choice, about a future they would face together. The women walked beside him at times, no longer clinging in fear but moving with quiet confidence. They sang softly as they went, their voices blending in a gentle song that carried across the land. The cowboy listened, his steps lighter than before. When night came, they built a fire in a sheltered hollow. The flames flickered against the rocks and the stars spread wide above them. The cowboy sat across from the women, his rifle resting nearby. They shared the last of their food, and then the women began to speak again, their voices calm and strong. They told him stories of their people, of dances under the moon, of rivers where children played, of the strength of families that had endured for generations. Their words painted pictures in the firelight, and though he did not understand every detail, he understood the meaning. The cowboy then spoke of his own life. He told them about long nights alone on the prairie, about the cattle drives and the endless miles of trail. He admitted that he had often wondered if he would die without leaving anything behind, no one to remember his name. His voice was quiet, almost ashamed, but when he finished, the women shook their heads and touched his hand. One of them said in broken English, "Not alone. Not now." The cowboy felt his throat tighten. He looked into their eyes and saw the truth there. He was no longer a man drifting alone in the world. He was something more. He had become their protector, their guide, and in return they had given him loyalty and a kind of family he never thought possible. The fire burned low as the night deepened. The women fell asleep near the flames, their faces peaceful. The cowboy sat awake for a while, listening to the crackle of wood and the soft sigh of the wind. His hand rested on the bead one of the women had given him days earlier. He held it tightly, as if it were a promise carved into stone. At last he lay down beside the fire, his heart steady, his mind at peace. The dangers of the trail were not gone. Riders could return, storms could rise, and the land itself would always test them. But now, whatever came, they would face it together. The cowboy closed his eyes, whispering into the darkness, "Where I go, you go. That's my word." And under the wide and endless sky, with the fire burning low and the 3 women close by, the vow was sealed. Not in ceremony, not in writing, but in the bond of trust, loyalty, and the simple truth that sometimes family is found in the most unexpected of places. The trail ahead stretched into mystery, but the cowboy no longer feared it. With 3 Apache women beside him, his heart carried a strength greater than any weapon. They would ride together, not as strangers, not as captives and rescuer, but as a family bound by choice. And in that bond lay the promise of a future no danger could ever break.